I used to be friends with a girl who had just a dozen or so movies that she liked on her laptop, watching them over and over and over again. Many of them were popular films with significant portions edited out. She'd had a friend cut out all of the scenes featuring any violence or sexuality, no matter how slight, with very few comedic exceptions. And she didn't even consider anyone's recommendations of other films, even if that friend would have edited them. She reasoned that it was because she had only ever watched those dozen or so films and wouldn't need any more since she had the edited versions of them, and that she couldn't handle anything shocking unexpectedly. Needless to say, her other friends and I all found her strange and at times annoying to hang out with. But at least I can say that she was by far the nicest and most honest person I've ever known. We called her Angel for reasons that should be obvious. On the evening of October 31st, 2016, a group of friends went to hang out at a park that got pretty spooky after dark. Angel lived alone in a nearby apartment complex, so when we started getting cold and decided to go indoors, we went with her. Her apartment was largely unfurnished, with the notable exception of the bedroom. The floor was entirely covered by mattresses, and there were dozens of pillows, blankets, and plushies scattered around. There were several comfy armchairs facing the TV, which sat on the top of a stool at the back of the room in front of the window. Next to it was her laptop, connected to the TV. This was where she watched her favorite movies, and had many of us watch them more than once. That night, the friend who had originally edited those films to her liking managed to convince her that we should watch scary YouTube videos. We stuck to obviously fake ghost caught on tape ones, which at least outwardly didn't bother Angel, and she said it was because she didn't believe in ghosts. An hour or so later, she said she was bored and wanted to put on Patch Adams. It was her all-time favorite film, with the edits, of course. She watched it practically daily. We had all seen it at least once before. Not the most exciting film on a Halloween night, but she couldn't be talked out of it. At this point, my best friend and his girlfriend left, but the rest of us stayed because we weren't planning on actually watching it. We would just talk about ghosts or whatever. So she double-clicked on patchadams.mp4, and the film began. She was actually watching it, but she'd seen it 1,000 times, so she also talked over it about paranormal stuff with us. Her editor friend, though, seemed like he was having a hard time focusing on the conversation. After the part where Patch holds the skeleton and says, "I have a boner," suddenly it cut to the scene in imprint where the girl hangs upside down, with needles stuck in her gums. When she saw it, Angel screamed and backed up to the corner, hid under a blanket, and wailed in the most heartbreaking way I've ever heard the displeasure of hearing. It was like she was mourning the death of a child or something. She just kept crying and moaning no matter what we said. Even her editor friend apologized, saying it was a prank and that it was just a movie too. Before we had started watching the YouTube videos, he had replaced the Patch Adams file with a new edit that included fucked up scenes from horror movies. But already that first one was too much for Angel. Me and another friend decided it wouldn't be a good idea to leave her alone, so we stayed the night. She stopped crying eventually, but in the morning, we realized she'd pissed herself and was still shaking. We got her to drink some water, but she wouldn't say a word. Neither of us could stay, so we called her sister and told her what happened. Her reaction was like, "I'm coming, stay with her," but wouldn't explain why Angel was the way she was. The other friend left, and I waited for her sister, trying to get her to at least look at me. But she just stared into emptiness. When her sister came, she rushed to Angel and held her. I awkwardly left because I was already late, and after work, I called Angel's sister to ask if I could come by. She said it would be good, but I should be extra careful. I shouldn't even talk about what had happened, because it would only make her relive it. So I went there, and her sister explained quietly that Angel witnessed a brutal rape and possibly murder when she was only 7, and had to hide in a dumpster. She stayed inside for hours, in the pitch-black darkness, and had to walk home at night. Anything too shocking sent her mind back to that dumpster. She'd never watched a horror movie in her life. That scene and imprint sent her way over the edge. As far as I know, she never returned to normal. Last I saw her, she still wouldn't speak more than short childlike sentences, and was like a little kid. I wouldn't say she seemed unhappy, but being her friend was too hard when all she cared about were coloring books and plushies, and talked to me like I was an older family friend or something rather than a friend. It was like her memories of her friends were gone. Shortly after that Halloween night, her sister moved in to help her in her daily life. Her sister told me she hadn't dared to watch Patch Adams after that. A prank ruined her favorite movie for her. Moral of the story: some people might have a reason why they can't handle horror films. 2009 summer. Out on exercise with our team. Fucking middle of nowhere. It's ass. Doing standard hotshot junk and prepping for forest fires. I'm a human Smokey the Bear. Speaking of bears, goddamn, there are a lot of bears. We've seen bears before. We're not even really worried about them anymore. Honestly, the bears might think we're one of them at this point. Standard safety precautions are taken. We think little of it since most of us are pretty seasoned. Nighttime comes on day 3, and we can hear bears, somewhere out there, fighting. This isn't unusual, and it doesn't rightly bother us. But then something does. The cries of an injured bear fill the air in the wee hours of the morning, followed by a piercing howl. Not a wolf, not a deer, and not a moose. No fucking idea what. Not the kind of gentleman to be shaken by the prospect of a cryptid in the woods, and also because we all, in the back of our minds I'm sure, assumed it was a moose. Foreman makes mention to the bears. If there's an injured bear out there, we need to be careful, because that means there's an even larger bear, or highly aggressive bull moose out there too, and we do not want to fight that. The day goes as normal, wood cutting, trail marking, prep, so on and so forth. We hear the occasional howl from the bear, which we know is somewhere in the area, but not anywhere we can determine. Lunch mess comes around, and a crew of 4 doesn't return, with no radio contact. Assignment was to head to a nearby river tributary and collect water samples for the Department of Fish and Game. Volunteer with another 3 to go find them. Assume radio's just fucked up. Head down the river. On the way, we distantly hear that same shout from the night before. It echoes through the woods, a high-pitched, positively monstrous call, the likes of which I have never heard. It does, indeed, rattle us to the bone quite a bit. But being the stock of men who think with a measure of rationality, we still all firmly believe it to be a moose or a distorted call from another large animal. We reach the river mouth and spy the crew's gear and 2 of the crew. What are you doing? They're radio dead, sure as shit. Other 2 guys are just upstream a bit and come down. We help them pack and get moving on. As we pack up, one of them shouts out, "Holy fuck, what's that?" He points to a tree line some 200 meters opposite of us. Peeking from the tree line, just barely visible, is a head. Easily 2.5, maybe 3 meters off the ground. All that's really certain is that this is a massive animal. We look on in bewilderment for a moment before it ducks back in the trees. I think that's our moose. Big fucker, innit? RTB with crew in tow. Informed team, we saw the moose on the opposite side of the river, and it was huge. Team makes note, and we advise to stay clear of unnecessary activity by riverbank, since the moose may be there looking for females to rut, even if it is just past the season. Back to work. Night comes and the familiar sounds of Mother Nature unleashing her great titans on one another fill the air. A storm rolls in around midnight and fills the air with the echoes of a deluge of rain, the kinds of which the Bible tells us swept away the old world. Rolling thunder filled the air, and we all learned a bit on why the bombing campaign on North Vietnam was named such a thing. And we were all left to silently wonder if the USAF's B-52s could even hope to match how loud this storm was. But even through all of that infernal howl filled the air, drowning out even the grandest of Mother Nature's symphonies. At one point in the night, the screams, which had slowly worked their way through the woods, came from what I would say was mere hundreds of meters from our camp, within visual distance, surely. When the day began, the storm had not subsided, but the screams had. Our metal tests, but not cracked. Our foreman was more inconvenienced with this than anything. Look, that damn moose is bold. We're going to erect some barriers, and we'll put down some repellent. Keep it out of the camp. Today's job orders are a standard affair, and we'll be coordinating with another hotshot trail maintenance unit coming through today, hosting them this evening, and on their way they'll go. I'm assigned to the maintenance party, so we go to meet our brethren. The team meets up with us after a few short hours of work. Immediately notice they all look unsettled. What's up, boys?
We found a set of bears about 3 clicks out.
A set?
Like 4.
4?
Dead. Mauled. Absolutely fucking destroyed.
Radio foreman, get permission to go look. Team and us get a move on. We reach an area with some natural rock covering, a good place for bears to live. What we see is nothing I have ever seen before. 4 bears, 3 adults, and a single cub, over an area maybe 200 meters, all gored and mauled to death. A pair of trails leading way, the storm made mud of much of this area. One, a set of tracks headed to our camp, that of a small grizzly. The other, hooves, large, bigger than any moose print I have ever seen, by an order of magnitude. A typical moose track is 13 to 18 centimeters in length. This is easily 22 to 24 centimeters. What's more is it's slightly more rounded, implying the animal has naturally more mass to it than a moose of comparable size would. What the fuck is this thing? The bears are gored to death, heads split, intestines strewn about, chests collapsed, and the cub looks like it was simply trampled to death, maybe by the assaulter, maybe by its own, in an effort to escape. Whatever this thing is, it's fucking huge. The rest of the day goes as scheduled. Returning to camp, we see a set of barriers have been erected about 4 feet high, and a line of powder has been laid down. Repelling powder is a common part of hotshot crew kit for driving away large predators and other wildlife. Its strong odor is offensive even to humans, but even more so to the olfactory gifted. Night chow is hearty in large portions, more than normal. The night is clear and cool, and we spend time standing around mingling in our own impromptu tent city. Just before lights out, the scream is heard in the distance. A panic wave sweeps through the other hotshots.
It fucking followed us.
What?
We've been stalked by that same howl since last week. We thought it ditched us 2 days ago, but it's fucking back.
What is it?
We don't know. We've never seen it.
It's been here for about 3 days.
A second scream billows out from somewhere else in the woods. An immediate call is heard after. There's 2 of them. The new foreman is visually shaken. Our foreman, a massive rock on which the wave's many immense troubles have broken, and whose fists have likely broken many more jaws. Even he seems a bit unnerved by this. We are 40 well-trained, experienced, fit woodsmen, and at the moment, I remember hearing that these calls were clearly from 2 different members of the same species. Clearly complementary in nature. I felt my heart drop to my feet. An icy shiver ran up my spine, and I reached for my gun. The night was marked with the encroaching calls of these unseen tormentors. Sleep was impossible. Just before sunup, a call came that sent a collective fear through the camp, the likes of which we never felt again. A call from inside the camp. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was bravery. But I looked. And there, in the middle of the camp, silhouetted by meager light, I saw what I can only describe as a horror. At its shoulder, it was easily 2 meters. Its head was easily 40 centimeters more than that. Atop its twisted head sat a bed of thorn-like outgrowths that I hesitantly call antlers, spanning outwards in a sprawling nightmare. Jagged teeth puzzled its pale brown fire around its face as 4 massive legs carried it, seemingly effortlessly, through the Rasputia with a gentle squish. Its soulless black eyes gleamed with ethereal bewilderment as it seemingly floated through the camp, its hot breath steaming from its elongated snout. The antlers were blackened and glistened with what I can only assume was blood. This was our bear slayer. This was our monster. It had never managed to develop to a point of full fear for me until these last few hours. I seldom had time to process that we could really be dealing with something that defied logic or reasonable explanation before the eldritch horror presented itself to me. I clutched the handle of my Smith & Wesson tightly. The 4.5-inch long 50 caliber monster seemed much more monstrous when the prospect of defending myself against the bear was my worst-case scenario. But now, I was contemplating employing 5 rounds of 400-grain 50 caliber bullets against what might as well have been a dinosaur. Others in my unit looked on, in what I can only describe as a feeling of abject horror and wonder, as the great being walked through our camp, swinging its massive horn side to side, stepped oh so casually over our barrier, and let out a proud yell, continuing in the direction of the other scream. The morning came soon after, but the screams did not stop for some time after. No work orders were handed out that day. There was no mess. There was no movement. We waited to be attacked by 2 great beasts from a land that time forgot. The attack never came. My foreman called in project delay due to wildlife activity, citing wolf packs as being the issue. Who would blame him? No one would. We just saw a living, breathing god of the forest. The night came, and the screams came closer. Those of us with guns clutched them strongly to our chest. Between us, we threw more mass in a single 1-second burst than a single 76mm shell did. But we wondered if that could even be enough to stop these things if we had to. Sometime just before midnight, they came to our camp. I looked again. For some reason, I was less scared this time. It wasn't as horrifying a concept to see our monsters. These two, a male and a female, wandered through our camp casually. Their hot breath issued from their long, jagged mouths, sniffing the air occasionally. The male was the same of the night before, but the female was just slightly less than his in size, without horns. I had neglected to notice it, but the male had tusks jutting from his lower jaw, at least 1.5 meters long. They strode through the area, mostly silently, for about 20 minutes. As they left, in what was a horrifying display of power, the male's leg struck a medium-weight ATV we use, tipping it over and pushing it a good 2 meters. Their calls were heard through the night as they wandered away into the woods. Morning came with an unsettling silence. Work orders came. Armed and ready, we went about our business. For 2 days after, there was no sound, no wildlife, but birds and insects singing and buzzing. Satisfied the great beings were gone, we got back to our job. We all agreed, just before we left, that this would never go public. And who would believe us after all? I am convinced what I saw has a logical explanation. They were not horrible, disfigured-looking animals, but their size was absolutely beyond that which I thought was possible for any terrestrial animal. They were most certainly a member, or relative, of the same family as moose or elk. But their size, their tusks, I just don't know. But this is not the end, my friends. 2012. I find myself and 2 former members of the 2009 crew back in the last frontier again. We sit in a restaurant, drinking beer and eating. A trio of state rangers come in, half dressed in uniform. We offer them a seat and drinks, perhaps for some interdepartmental intrigue. We drink ourselves to a fine buzz and begin talking about some of the oddities we encountered in our days. One of the other hotshots look at us, nods, and starts a story. Summer of 2009. We exchange parts of the story and give equal accounts of what we saw. The Rangers, mouth agape each of them, listen in abject enthrallment. After a few moments of silence, one speaks up.
You saw one too.
They've seen them. There's varying reports. Sometimes they have 3 eyes, sometimes they have 1. Sometimes they talk, sometimes they imitate voices. Sometimes they eat flesh. Sometimes they just walk and watch. But they always are huge. And they always have tusks. And they always scream. The Rangers have seen them, and one claims to have shot at one, with no effect. Hunters in the north have claimed to see them for decades, and locals claim them to be forest spirits for centuries. From Anchorage to Deadhorse, sightings of all sorts of these things come in. They aren't repressed, they aren't hidden, but those who do report them get the reports swept beneath the tide of a billion other less credible cryptic reports of seeing something out there. But these things, they are out there. Reminders of a bygone era, creatures from a time long past, surviving in the Alaskan and Canadian wilderness, where men dare not venture. If you see one, you might be blessed, you might be cursed, but don't let them look you in the eye, or they'll fucking kill you. That seems to be the one thing that the myth lives consistent on. Looking at them in the eye is an act of aggression. They don't seem scared of people, just disinterested. The Rangers tell us hunters have seen them, and the natives say that looking at them can make a man go mad. But they never go near cities. The forest is their home, and they can have it. The closest real thing I have seen to it are the renderings of the Irish grey elk, but even it is too small. I could understand how some think, if they see it, it's a very large moose. But the tusks, the antlers, and the call is anything but. When I was 20, I was out of a job and didn't have any university or plans on going to university. I was basically lost in limbo, without knowing where to turn next. I was living at home and spent hours on the internet, staying up all night and sleeping all day. I was always a bit of an introvert that preferred the company of me, myself, and I. Staying up through the night and disregarding the day was a way out of the norm and avoiding people altogether. Then I got the classic talk from my dad that all kids get when they're useless, sitting at home doing nothing. I was tired of hearing it, so I decided I needed to move out to continue my lazy, antisocial behavior. I have family way up north in the sticks. There's nothing around except a couple sawmills and a couple nickel mines. My grandfather has a piece of property that is over 350 acres of unexplored bush. It was hardly farmable, just a giant section of woods, streams, ponds, and rock. My grandfather has a timeshare in Florida, so he was gone for the rest of the year. I called him and asked if I could go up there to live. In exchange, I would do lumberjacking for wood to sell and use. I remember his comments exactly.
Yeah, I don't give a shit. You're wasting your time up there. No work, no school, no people, no internet. But if that's what you want, go ahead and knock yourself out. Just don't burn down my fucking house.
My bags were already packed. I knew he wouldn't mind. I told my dad what I was doing. He was pretty much speechless and had a look of concern. He then told me I was wasting my life and should go to school. I told him it was what I wanted and needed to do. We parted ways. I got into my '93 Civic hatch that had a shot suspension and bald tires and took a 14-hour car ride to no man's land. I was happier than a pig in shit. I made myself good and comfy when I got to the house. It was given to my grandfather by an Irishman that passed on. He built the house with his family in the mid-1800s as a kid, and been there ever since. If you ever seen the Amityville Horror, it looks just like that house, but much, much smaller. The stove was an old black cast iron beast, the kind you only see in movies or on an old historic village tour. It had a large barn full of tools and an old JD tractor, a smokehouse for meats, a large veggie garden, an outhouse, and a chicken coop that wasn't in use anymore. After unpacking and relaxing, the distance and fact that I was alone began to set in. There wasn't a TV, internet, or video game in sight. Luckily, my grandfather had 2 snowmobiles, a 4-wheeler, a gator, and dirt bike, and lots of hunting rifles and shotguns to boot. I figured most of my time would be spent outdoors, which was okay, but I was a bit nervous. The next day, I drove into town, if you could even call it that. I stocked up on canned goods and cupboard food that could survive a nuclear holocaust. I came back and got to lumberjacking. It was slow at first to remember everything my grandpa had shown me when I was a kid, 8 to 12 years old. But after 4 or 5 hours, I had it down pat. I'd take the tractor, chains and hooks, a jerry can, and chainsaw to the bush. I'd find a cedar or spruce tree and cut it down, chain it up to the tractor, and drag it off to the main trail, where I had a normal flatbed trailer waiting. I'd then cut it up to 2 to 3 foot sections and stack it. Once the trailer was full, I would tow it to the barn, where in the back was a large hydraulic wood splitter. I would split it into 4 to 6 sections, depending on diameter of the piece. Once I cut it all, I stacked it all. This was the routine. It was long and hard work, But it gave me a purpose, and gave me joy. I thought of myself as a pioneer. I was in the great outdoors, alone, taking down trees and supplying villagers with something they needed to survive. I felt proud of myself, and made cash doing it. While I wasn't getting rich, I had enough for all the amenities that were needed to survive in such a place. I kept this routine for months, and locals began coming to me for wood because it was cheap, and I was a youngster looking after my grandfather's home, who was well thought of in town. Then, winter came. Everything went to shit. Winter on the farm was one of the most depressing times of my life. Not being able to do much work and have no interesting human contact or internet really brought me down. I reflected on my life and the fact that I had no friends anymore because I had abandoned them with no warning. Why I did this, I do not know. But I had some type of mental feeling that I had to leave everyone behind and never speak to them again. I began having suicidal thoughts. The more I thought about offing myself, the more I accepted it as being an okay thing to do. I wasn't religious, so I didn't have the thought of going straight to hell. I viewed it more as if a goldfish were to die. Where do you think it would go? I think it doesn't go anywhere. It is just dead blackness. No more thoughts, like turning off a car for good. I thought about how my family would miss me and how it would hurt them. But I was so depressed, unhappy, and discomforted by my progress in life, and the fact that I had no one. After a few weeks of -30°C weather and brutal snow, I decided to get on a snowmobile, load up my snowshoes, take my rifle, and go deep into the bush to end my mental suffering. I had given up on everything. I jumped on the sled at 8 a.m. The sun was brighter than ever. You couldn't look anywhere without squinting your eyes like an Eskimo. The sun reflected off the snowy landscape as if it were a mirror. With a full tank and a jerry can as a backup, I could go a long ways away. I let the skidoo idle and get warmed up. I was thinking to myself that I might actually go through with this. I kept going over what ifs and buts in my head, as if I were trying to talk myself out of it. I said fuck it out loud and jumped on the skidoo and let it rip. I took the tractor trail as far as it would go into the bush. It ends after a solid 45-minute drive, then turns into four-wheeler and gator trails. I took a trail deeper and deeper. After a solid 2.5 hours of riding, the trail stopped and did a U-turn. It was the end of the track. I then grabbed my rifle and put on my snowshoes. I quickly realized something. I hadn't written a note for anyone to find my body, or even know what I had done. I knew that if my parents had no idea what happened to me, they would wander for the rest of their lives, and it would tear them apart. I yelled out, "Fuck!" and threw my rifle. I paced towards my sled and repeated what I said. I started to turn and remember I literally just threw my rifle.
Shit!
Get off the sled and walk towards rifle. I bend down and grab it, and stand up. Then, froze stiff. A burst of adrenaline was injected throughout my entire body, and turned my cold frame into a steel oven. There was a black figure in the distance, hiding behind a tree watching me. It wasn't an animal. It looked like the shape of a man, but it wasn't a man. I ran onto my sled and hit the throttle. I ripped back home and didn't look back. To get back home, it only took me maybe 2.5 hours. I rode hard. I got inside the house, put coffee on, and ate fried bologna with beans and toast. As I pigged out, I kept that thing's image in my head, and I was wondering what it was. How did it get there? For how long has it been here? Does it know I'm here? How could it survive? Is it coming for me? Can it follow my snowmobile tracks? Does my grandpa know? I then decided to call my grandfather in Florida. He didn't answer his phone. He was probably chilling on the beach, drinking beers. I thought, fuck. I called my dad just to calm my nerves. He could sense something was off about me and asked me what was up. I told him I was out hunting and I seen something. I described what I seen and he went silent over the phone. He took a breath and he said,
Son, when I was a kid living on the farm, me and a girl went back to the lake for a swim. We got there on our bicycles in August. I had my rifle with me because of all the bears that passed through the land. After me and the girl were swimming around and laughing and doing our thing, she screamed and pointed across. I looked across the pond, and there stood what looked like a burned-up human being. He was charred up, had a bit of head hair, eyes as bright and blue as I'd ever seen. Its arms were so long, its hands nearly came to its knees. It screeched at us with the most insane volume I had heard, that birds flew out of the trees. I ran out of the pond, grabbed my rifle and shot at it. It ran into the trees and me and the girl jumped on our bikes and gave it shit all the way home. That was the first and final time I had ever seen that thing. I actually hadn't thought of it in years and years until you told me about it. You need to be really fucking careful, son. In fact, why don't you just come home? It's boring up there anyways.
I told him I was staying and enjoyed it here. I was lying now. I got off the phone with him feeling no better. The only difference was I could think clearer. I thought, if this thing is coming for me, it's going to take a while, by foot. I got time. I got the guns and put a loaded one in every room. Some had slugs, some had shells. I also had a hatchet that I sharpened to a very fine thickness, with a stone grinder in the barn. If I swung at your wrist with one swift motion, it would probably take your hand right off. Or at least leave it hanging by a thread. As nightfall drew closer, I made one final meal and killed all the lights and left all the blinds open for good visibility, and to make it harder for whatever is out there to see me inside. I went upstairs, which was 2 bedrooms that had large windows and one walkout balcony. I thought this would be an excellent spot to watch and snipe. As I settled in to see if this thing would come, I began thinking about what I was going to do earlier. I still was depressed, but because I was active and keeping my mind onto something, I didn't feel like offing myself anymore. Maybe that was it, I thought. Keeping active, busy, and productive, with a bit of excitement thrown in, keeps your mind off of shit that doesn't really matter anyways. Just as I was having a bit of a personal milestone, I heard heavy footsteps in the snow. I looked out the window, and before my eyes stood that thing that I had seen earlier, but now in full view. I got a strong feeling of nervousness, and my abdomen tightened and barked at me, as if I were about to shit myself at any moment from sheer fear. It was just as my dad described to me. Piercing blue eyes, almost glowing. The moonlight reflected off of them like the cover of the dark side of the moon. It had the color and appearance of the grit in the bottom of your barbecue, if you don't clean it much. I ran out on the porch to get a shot off. It darted around the house before I could even lift my weapon.
Fuck!
Ran inside again, ran to the other window. I could see it again, just standing there like an idiot watching me. I turned the crank, and the window opened up. I said,
Who are you?
It didn't respond. It just stared at me. I repeat,
Tell me who you are, or I'm going to shoot you.
It then said its name. It said, in a slow, drawn-out, harsh, hoarse voice,
You're not my name.
I said,
"What do you want with me? I'm minding my own business. What are you doing here? Please, leave me."
It then walked closer to the house and looked up at me. My nose was filled with the most pungent odor ever. It then said,
"If you won't, I will."
in that same exact voice that can almost not be described unless it was mimicked with some type of computer sound program. I said,
"Do what?"
It responded,
"Kill yourself. You failed."
My heart froze.
"I decided not to do it."
It then stretched its arms out to the wall of the house and began scaling it like it was fucking Spider-Man. I yelled and panicked from sheer shock and fumbled my rifle. It fell right out of the fucking window, and by that time, it was feet away from the window. It reached its god-awful hand into the window and cut my arm with its fingernail. I grabbed my hatchet and buried it in its forearm, and it made a sound a bear makes when you shoot it. It fell to the ground on its side, and I ran for the spare gun in the room. I came back to the window, and it was running for the barn. I took a shot, but it didn't do much. This gun had a shell and isn't ideal for the range I fired at. I pushed my dresser to the hall and pushed it down the stairs. I then pushed the bed to the hall and pushed it down the stairs. Then pushed a few end tables and the staircase. I essentially clogged it up so it couldn't get up there from the main floor. I know it can climb, but I would prefer to only have to cover 2 sides than multiple sides. I locked the door and just kept my eyes and ears open. I didn't see it again. Daybreak came quick. I could see its blood droplets in the snow. I climbed over and pulled shit out of the stairs and investigated. It was nowhere to be found. I grabbed my rifle and followed the droplets. It went down the tractor trail. I walked for 10 minutes following this trail. I could see it go off even further, and its foot tracks as well. I decided it wasn't worth it to go ahead and hunt it. It probably went as deep, if not deeper, the first time that I had seen it. I decided it was time to leave this place for good. I went inside and grabbed my clothes, got into my car and started driving off. I never told my dad or my grandpa. I still have nightmares of this thing, and I wonder how it knew what I was thinking, or going to do. I've been trying to research other sightings and descriptions of it, but can find nothing, unfortunately. I don't want to say it's a demon because I really don't know or believe in that religious crap. I don't know what it is. No idea. All I know is for the last 8 years since it has happened, I have had a slew of health problems and bad luck. I have night terrors of Jerdok almost 95% of my sleeps. I have to take medications just to fall asleep. I think it may have been the nail that cut me when it reached into the window. I often wonder if it is still up there. I know that this isn't an ending worthy to the story, but it is what it is. What else can I say? OP continues to describe the monster. I think it may have been 6 foot 3 inches or so, quite tall. It had a very long face, a large overbite. It looked human, but not human, and almost like it was missing some chromosome or something. Maybe one day when I get a death wish, I'll head back and go for it. My grandpa passed away 4 years ago. The property was sold to clear cutters by my dad and his sisters. As far as I know, the house was knocked down and they put up a small office and living quarters for the lumberjacks who clear cut out there. This is near Chapleau, Ontario, off the beaten path. Another user responds, "That's a little unfortunate. Maybe you could pose as a reporter and call the clear-cutter barracks or visit them and ask if anyone has seen anything. OP replies, I actually did that maybe 3 years ago. The workers had already been there for a year. I actually said that I was a fisheries and wildlife technician for the region, and that I had heard of a sighting of a creature, and described as the one that I encountered. They said they hadn't seen anything of the sort. You gotta remember though, my grandfather's land had boundaries, but past those boundaries, the bush simply continues on crown land for miles upon miles. It's basically a frontier. I somehow doubt it is dead because my dad had seen it. I had seen it over 25 years when he seen it, and it knew my thoughts. There's something about it that isn't natural. Also, I hammered it in the forearm with that axe. I know for a fact I broke its forearm bones because I heard them break. I also know the axe went all the way through its arm because the flat back of the axe was buried into its arm. If it's like you and me, that kind of wound in negative 25 Celsius degree weather, it's highly possible it did die. But I don't know, man. I think about it a lot. I sometimes wish, like you guys have said, that I continued on and tracked it. But I was spooked. It was cold, and I was shook to my core. Never knew you could feel that kind of fear and worry up to that point. As I said before, I need antidepressants, sleep meds, and now I have a valve in my heart. I'm only 28. I have no history of family health issues. I was an athlete growing up. I was an outdoorsman. It all went downhill when I left. I never told my dad or my grandfather. I thought my dad or my grandfather would want to go hunting for it. And I really didn't want them to get hurt. Or worse. Alrighty. I lived in the house pictured from 1993 to 1998. So from when I was 4 years old to when I was 10 years old, we moved after my 10th birthday. My parents are smart people. They're both professors at our local university and make damn good money. So, a beautiful character home such as ours, though I should say theirs, wasn't a big deal to me. I warn you, there is no spooky attic or basement here. So if it's a secret box under lock and key in the forgotten corners of a dusty, ghost-ridden area, you are out of luck. But not entirely. If you take a look on the right side of the house, that top 2 windows of the nice sculpted brick was my room. To the left was my parents' master suite, and sweet it was. The basement had been renovated in such a manner that exchange students would stay there a while away from their home country. I learned many interesting things about many different cultures, but never will I forget the impression that Katya from Pensa, Russia. She was quiet. I don't remember what she studied, but she was at our house when I was 9 years old. I distinctly remember saying very little to her until one day when I was playing in the front yard as she was coming home.
Devaka,
She said in a soft voice, kneeling next to me.
do you like to live in this house?
It took me a moment to answer because of the thickness of her accent, but I nodded when I understood. She nodded herself and stood, walking around the back and going into her basement apartment for the day. I don't think I spoke to Katya once more after that, only hearing about her. I was about to sneak downstairs for that one last glass of juice, any reason to stay up, when I heard my parents talking in the living room.
She says she hears us walking around at unheard of hours, and it keeps her up, and she says it's definitely the sound of an adult. What do you think?
My dad asked. My mom hummed for a minute before answering.
She complained of that smell again to me today, and the strangest thing is, I know what she's talking about. She describes the same smell as when we thought we had those septic problems. But we know everything's fine. so I really don't know.
My father thumbed through another page of his book.
You remember that guest lecturer in the intro to philosophy class that I had? The one who said the mind can trick itself into believing into something? Better watch yourself, dear.
He smiled devilishly, and my mother laughed. At this time, I had been noticed, and my mother appeased me by getting a glass of juice and tucking me back in bed. I couldn't sleep now. My mind went crazy with what Katja could have been experiencing. The mystery was so great to me. I decided then and there I would stay up all night the next night to see if I could hear or smell anything strange too. The next night was a Friday, and my parents were going out of town for a business conference. They asked if Katja would babysit me for the night, and she agreed. We had a lot of fun. We watched movies and ate junk food till it was getting pretty late. Around 11, well past my bedtime, I noticed Katja becoming uncomfortable. She wouldn't sit still. Her eyes constantly moved around the room, and I could tell she was trying not to alarm me. I asked her what was wrong. She said nothing. Instead, she suggested we had a slumber party and sleep in my room. I was in. I didn't have any siblings, so a cool Russian older sister was awesome. She closed my door and did my hair. She had rolled out some blankets on the floor for her to sleep on and let me ask her all sorts of questions about her home. I learned many things about Russia that night. I won't bore you with the factlets now. Katja was clearly trying to concentrate on anything over whatever was bugging her. Around midnight, something took my attention away from whatever we had been doing. A stench so strong I clenched my eyes shut. It smelled in such a way that I'd never be able to give the stench justice by trying to explain it here. I opened my mouth to protest the stink, but Katja practically slammed her hand over my mouth and wrapped her free arm around me so tightly, I was scared my head was going to pop off. She stared intensely at the door. I stared too. Her eyes were narrowed, but frightened. I wanted to ask what was going on, but not only couldn't physically, but I'm sure mentally, I wouldn't have been able to do as well. Then, I heard shuffling. Soft at first, but as the stench grew clearer and more putrid, the shuffling got louder. Footsteps, dragging footsteps that sounded like who, or whatever, was walking didn't know how to lift their feet. They sounded wet, like a grown person trudging through thick mud. A low groan accompanied the sound. It was both tortured and angry, a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days. The shuffling stopped right outside my door. Whatever was out there was listening to see if we were inside, if we were awake. I saw Katja's cheeks puff. She was holding her breath. Her hand covered my mouth and nose, and though I could barely breathe, I knew she was silencing any sound that I could make either. We sat that way for what felt like eternity, and I'm surprised I didn't pee my pants in fear on that night. I barely remember anything after, only Katja finally releasing me from her death grip with a sigh, and me falling in and out of sleep through that night. The result of the conference was my parents being transferred to a university in another town. They arranged for another home for Katja before we moved, only a month later, right after my 10th birthday, just as I mentioned. I think back to that thing that haunted the hall of our house, how neither me or my parents had complained about it before. When I asked my parents in later years, they admitted several exchange students had mentioned hearing footsteps and smelling that smell. But it was always at insanely early in the morning, the types of times that only a university student pulling an all-nighter are all too familiar with. As for the thing itself and its purpose, well, I know it hadn't intended to creep into our rooms while we slept to kill us. No, it was making sure we were asleep. What it would do if we were not asleep, I never will and never want to know. I've never visited this board, so excuse any errors I make regarding board culture. Here's a story that is currently happening to me. I'll give a little background and then go Greentext. My buddy David has 800 acres near Galena, Alaska. We're up here building onto his house and fishing the nearby rivers on our off days. We're about 15 miles back on a gravel road that goes further into the Bureau of Land Management. There are a few logging trucks a day on the main road, but basically, no traffic after the sun sets. The first day we got here together in my Tacoma 4x4. We unscrewed the plywood off the windows, brought our bags onto the porch, got his generators started up, and unlocked his various outbuildings. The air was stale and a little rank, like a dead cat. Opened side door to kitchen, opened the back door of the cabin and let the windows that you could open. Didn't go upstairs, just let the place air out. Sat down on the porch to rest and quench our thirst. It's only been in the low 60s, but the plywood was heavy. We sat there and planned our remodel, generally shot the shit, and happy to be here. He fiddled with his bait and tackle, and I admired the view from the front porch. Now, I'm not really a ghost or spirit believer, but I saw something last weekend. It's real quiet, and there was a lull in our conversation. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw somebody walk out the open kitchen door. I rotated in my seat to see who was there. I barely saw the guy turn the corner towards the back of the house, towards the forest.
What the fuck?
David yells.
Did you see that motherfucker? I did, dude. Who the fuck is that?
David runs out to his truck, where he has a Mossberg 590A. It's buried deep in our Knox boxes, and we had a bunch of shit to unload to get to it. We just throw shit out of the truck till we get the box open. We decide to search the rest of the house first, scattergun in hand. We go upstairs. We look into 2 bedrooms, under beds and everything. Nothing. No signs of squatters, animals, nothing. We both affirm that we saw a little man with no shirt walk out of the kitchen door to our left from the main porch. We then go towards the back forest. The house and the pad they built on has a thick gravel base right up to the forest. The forest floor is a thick mat of leaves, needles, and duff, and hard to track in. We looked all around and found no tracks. With the sun going down and all of our shit exposed, we decided going further into the forest was a bad idea. We both go back inside and close all of the windows, unpack our tools, set up our gear in the lower 2 bedrooms. We regroup in the kitchen and start guessing who that was. Was it a squatter that was living elsewhere on the land and heard us opening up the plywood? A thief? An animal? Either way, we're 2 badass carpenters with guns, and not afraid to throw down with some little fucktard. We both go to bed. The next day we start setting up our tools and saws under tarps. We had the shotgun on a sawhorse nearby, unloaded table saws and miter saws, setting up sawhorses, getting all the blades adjusted, and going through the lumber he has on site. We brought cement to pour a post and pier foundation for his addition. We unloaded that and decided to go fish in a river about 300 yards downhill from us. He caught 2 trout right off the bat, and I caught one about 20 minutes in. It slowed down after that, and we hiked further upstream. That's where we heard rustling across the stream from us. It could have been any number of animals, so we stood sharp. We fished there for about 2 more hours, and Dave started gutting the fish we had. We both head up to the house to wash up and fry some fish. After the last few bites of fish go down, Dave stands up at the table. He says he left his Benchmade down there, where he was gutting the trout. He grabs a flashlight and heads down there. He said he looked for the rock with the fish's guts on them. Said his knife was there, but the fish guts were gone. He half jogged back to hide being scared. Later that night, right after we both go to our bedrooms and shut off the lights, in the total silence, I hear footsteps on the second story. I think maybe an animal or a squirrel snuck up there. Try to ignore it. It gets more frequent, with the steps going away from me towards the staircase. Dave calls out loudly.
Is that you up there? No,
I answer, now to my bedroom door. We both open our doors at the same time and step into the main room. We bumped off of each other in the dark and both looked at the upper staircase. I saw what looked like a small boy, but his face was almost featureless, and his eyes seemed pitch black in the low light. Dave yelled,
Who the fuck are you?
The figure slowly steps to the railing like he was going to answer us. Instead, he let out an incredibly loud, ear-ripping screech, like what you imagine a T-Rex would sound like. It was so loud I covered my ears and stumbled to the floor in the dark. It was so loud, it disoriented me. From the ground, I look up at the second floor just in time to see it run back into the bedroom. Dave ran past me with his Mossberg in hand. Dave ran to the top of the stairs and turned the hall light on. He then ran straight into the bedroom and out of my sight. Boom, boom, boom. At this point, I am beyond scared and almost physically shutting down, like heat stroke or hypothermia. I knew that those gunshots meant that Dave may have just killed somebody. Dave reappears at the top of the staircase.
He jumped out of the window and ran into the forest. He's like a deformed midget. His back was all fucked up and he was on his hands and knees. What? Did you hit him? If his legs are fucked up, how did he run away? I don't know, but he jumped out and ran into the trees.
We both went out the back door and turned on the exterior lights. There was no blood on the gravel. The smell of burnt powder was still in the wind.
Was he up there all day?
Dave says,
He must have been. He probably snuck up there while we were working. So why would he go up there? Anything of value?
Dave,
Fucking nothing. Old blankets and pillows. Dave, do you have your game cam?
Dave responds.
Yes, it's in the truck.
He goes out to his truck while I watch from the front door. Again, the enormous sound shatters the night. I imagined that the sonic crowd control weapons you hear about would feel like this. I instinctually covered my ears and let go a little pee into my boxers. Dave had dropped his gun and keys out of shock. He jumped into the Tacoma and locked the door. Keys and shotgun on the ground outside of his truck. I close the front door and stare at Dave through the window. He can see behind the house, and I can't. His mouth is agape. Figure, fuck this. Run out towards truck, grab gun, grab keys, and beat on window for Dave to open up. He turns to me as white as a ghost and opens the door. Frankly, I'm too afraid to look up towards the back of the house, and just rush back to the door with Dave in my arms. I slam the front door and start locking all doors and windows. Dave is pretty much in shock.
What did you see? What did you see?
Dave swallows deeply and says,
It was a stretched out dead guy that roared at us.
He then rolls over and barfs on his floor. I'm really starting to panic and experience tunnel vision. I never knew what that meant until that moment. I give Dave a rag and we sit on the couches.
Who the fuck was it, Dave? A dead guy?
Dave,
It looked dead and ashy, but it made that noise, and then made a scary face when it saw me. Its face moved into an evil shape. Let's leave, dude.
Dave,
I can't leave all of my tools here. Let's drive into town and get a motel then?
Dave simply says,
Okay.
We grabbed our phones and wallets and the Mossberg. Dave insisted on setting up the game cam before we left. He wanted it on the front door, but I said let's put it out back on a tree to see if this thing comes back. We put up the cam on a tree directly behind his house, under full gun coverage. We then jump into the Tacoma and peel away from the house. We drove back into town, but everything is booked, so we sleep in the truck. In the morning after breakfast, we drive back to his place. We pack up all of our tools as quickly as we can. We screw the plywood back up. Then, with the engine already running, I go retrieve the game cam. I didn't get to download them until today when I got back home. I'm pretty sure what we saw was that little man in the center and a little left of the tree. 1988. Be 8. Be Mexican American, spending summer in Mexico. Dad warned me since childhood it's dangerous to be out in the fields or in graveyards alone, especially at night. Grew a childhood fear of magic being real and alive in Mexico and elsewhere. Out in the countryside, and it's dark out. No electricity, only oil lamps, and I didn't know how to work one, so just hanging out on the front porch in the moonlight. Hear bugs being kinda loud. Louder than usual, actually. Hear steps. More than one person. Very close. There's no way I couldn't hear them sooner, when they were farther. Look around panicking. No voices, no banter. Just shuffling. Gets louder. Sounds like a fucking mob. Get up and run inside. Trip a few times, and psyching myself out thinking I was suddenly in a horror movie, and every stumble meant death. Close and lock the door. Grab fireplace poker that lie next to the doorway, and run into my room. Close the door. No lock. Window facing moon. The room is pretty well lit to adjusted eyes. Facing door for a long time with poker over shoulder, like a baseball bat. Hear nothing. Feel slightly at ease. Walk over to bed, about to let myself fall onto it. Look out of window at last moment. A lady draped in a headscarf, peering in. Land on bed. Feel super vulnerable and jolt. Let go of poker. She remained staring at me. She started showing her teeth. Not smiling. What the shit? A guy with a beard comes from the other side, whispering to her. Notices her staring in, turns the window, sees me, starts baring his teeth too. What the fuck is wrong with these people? Too scared to shout. Everyone else in house, still asleep. He lifts up his hand and starts pressing and inspecting the window, lightly banging on it. Looks like he's going to open it. What do? Holding my breath, pretty much just waiting for him to open or break the window like a pussy. Think these people are going to get in, drag me by my ankles, all the way to hell. Remember poker. Fuck common sense. Pick it up and run to the window. Smash the poker into the pane closest to the guy. Close eyes reflexively from glass and noise. Open them. Both people gone. Not a sound other than the wind getting in and crickets being loud. Lights turn on in the house. Dad and Uncle come into my room, ask why the door is closed, ask what I have been doing. See the window. Dad flips out. Dad starts shouting at me. Ask me what I was thinking. Tell him, in English, that there were people outside, staring at me. His eyes go wide, and he shuts up. Uncle confused. No speak English. My dad grabs me by the elbow and shouts at Uncle to gather everybody in the kitchen. Dad mutters something really quickly. Uncle shouts everyone to wake up. Get up, hurry up, etc., etc. Of 10 family members, 6 end up in kitchen. The other 4, Dad plus Uncle plus 2 older cousins, go out with a hunting rifle and an old service revolver and a couple shovels. They're gone for 10 minutes, which is a super long time when trying to tell Mom and other females what happened. Gossip occurs, and shit-eating aunt who likes to rile us up tells us kids it was La Llorona and her husband. La Llorona is no joke. Me and young girl cousin legit scared at that point. Mom and other aunt tell her off. Say that's overboard. Guys return back. Nothing. They'll look again in the morning, but nothing was stolen. No cars or tools or chickens or anything. We all decide to stay up. Fuck sleeping. Coffee and bread passed around, and ideas are exchanged about what that shit might have been. Thieves come up, spirits come up. Again, La Llorona comes up. Skinwalkers even come up. Sun comes up. The whole family goes out and checks everything. Blood outside my window. Uncle missed it. My mom audibly worries. Go on with day. Nothing else happens as we stay for a few more nights. Uncle and cousin and dad alternate guard duty. Except on the last night. Newspaper brought from nearest big town warns country folk about marauding bands of hyper poor people. Break into barns and farmhouses and kill owners. Take as much shit as they can carry and leave back to somewhere in the hills. Dozen people from a couple farmhouses dead already. Only a native farmhand who killed an intruder and drove himself to this town lived long enough to say what happened. But shitty doctor couldn't keep him alive. Apparently, that was my dad's first and only guess as to who those people were. I asked him about it years later, and asked what he told my uncle that night. My face when he said I saw gitanos, and my uncle instantly knew what to do. I look up what gitanos are in English. Gypsies. I've got some OC for you. All true, and what I have written word for word is exactly that. A few years back, when my parents had left the military, my father had trouble looking for work. We eventually moved into a lodge that my grandparents managed in the Northwest in order to make things work. As it turns out, the month we move in, a job opportunity for my father and large house right near my school becomes available. Mind you, the drive to my school from the lodge was 45 minutes, and becoming a strain on funds. A few months passed, and the only thing we really had complaints about with the home was the windows. At all times in this house was it freezing, and the power bill to crank the heat high enough to keep us warm was ridiculous. So, naturally, we began bundling up with extra blankets at night, and staying together in the same room during dinner with TV and etc. A note from here. At this time, we had 2 dogs. A hunting hound for my father, and a dachshund for me. The hound was nice, but more of a tool, while the dachshund was the family pet. Every night, this little wiener dog would hop up on my lap, do a few circles, then sleep between my ankles using either foot as a headrest. I love the little guy. One day towards the end of our stay in the home, we noticed some odd things. The most prominent of which was that during dinner, my father mentioned loving how the dachshund kept his feet warm some nights, that night in particular. I responded that I love that as well, but he must have been mistaken. I had kept my door closed after my dog came into my room, and my parents did as well. We passed it off as one of us was mistaken. The same night, I left the door open, as the dog had gone up to my parents' bedroom, and I hoped they would open it by going to the bathroom, or otherwise, and that he would return to me. Around 2:20-ish that morning, I heard the little chatter of dog's nails on the tile in the hallway, followed by the soft padding of feet on the shag carpeting. Then felt the small dog hop onto the bed, and eventually came to a rest between my feet. I remember smiling, feeling his warmth, then going to sleep. The next morning, I woke for school, just before my father left for work, and noticed my dog was gone. A little confused, I asked my father about it, whom informed me that the dog had joined him that night. We exchanged odd looks, but again, played it off as misremembering. Before I left for school, I saw that the dog had been left out that night in the backyard. With this, I suspected something was horribly wrong. By this, I mean I was tearing with fear as to what was happening. I was certain I had felt the dog, as was my dad, and yet he had stayed outside that night. I told my mother, who obviously didn't believe me. Later, I brought it up with my father. I remember him honestly showing some concern over it and offering a proposal.
He said, "Look, we'll leave the dog in your room. Lock your door and we'll see if something happens."
That night, I did as he asked and locked my door with the little dog in my room. We promptly fell asleep and awoke the next morning with little issue. When I opened my door, I found my father in the living room talking on the phone to what sounded like our pastor from church. The day following the pastor's visit went uninterrupted, and it seemed that whatever was happening was pacified. No strange feelings, no sounds, no vanishing dogs. Everything seemed normal. At this point, my mother and I noticed that the house was getting colder. But I remember my father just calling us wussies and saying if I ever wanted to go hunting with him, I would need to get a little more used to the cold. A week later, the dog things began happening again. We would hear the nails, then the footsteps, then feel the jump, and finally, the dog resting. I became so scared that I started locking my door, which did nothing to stop the happenings. One night, when I felt the dog jump into my lap, I flipped on my dresser light only to hear a door slam down the hall. I never did this again. We decided to take a vacation from the home, to get some perspective and release some tension. We went to visit family and snowboard for a while. When we got back, we found my little dachshund mutilated in the backyard. His chest had been covered in puncture wounds, and his legs were broken. Mind you, he wasn't dead. We brought him to the vet and they were able to patch him up, but they needed to keep him for a couple weeks. The happenings occurred nightly throughout this time. The day we brought him home, he seemed so happy, excited. We played with him and gave him table scraps. We were just happy he made it through whatever happened. That night, we found the dog in the backyard again with the same wounds. Only this time, he didn't make it. He was laid out on a scrap of cardboard, as if delivered to us. I shit you not. This was the most horrified and sad I had ever been. From here on, we didn't feel the dog on our lap, or hear the chatter in the hall, nor that familiar shag carpet sound. Only silence. Believe it or not, this is where things get really weird. My brother, at this time 6, began talking to an imaginary friend in his room. He wouldn't talk to us about it, but we could hear him through the door. He would talk about extremely vulgar things, and we could hear my brother saying that the things were bad, and that he would go to hell for saying them. I quote this next part. Brother.
"So what do you like to do anyway?"
Silence. Brother.
"You shouldn't say things like that. My mama says that Jesus doesn't like them."
Silence. Brother.
"Oh,
Silence. Brother.
okay. I'll see you later then."
At this point, we opened the door and found my brother staring into his opened closet. We asked him who he was talking to and about what, but he only responded,
"My friend in the closet. He won't let me say anything else."
We duct taped the closet shut. I don't know if I mentioned this, but most if not all of these happenings only happened at night, either right before we went to bed or around 2 a.m. We began sleeping in the living room together, my mom and dad on the couches, my brother and I in sleeping bags on the floor nearby. In the center of our room was a small kerosene furnace that kept us warm, as at this time, it had begun to get so cold that we couldn't keep warm with blankets alone. Things began happening separately to the family. My brother would wake up in his room, and we would find him in front of the closet with the duct tape peeled back, or missing altogether. I would hear footsteps down the hallway towards the garage, and hear an elderly male voice beckoning me. My mother would hear a young man's voice whispering my father's name at her and my father's head of the couch. And my father would see figures in the shadows, watching us. I would cry myself to sleep often, and as I type this, my own fear is making my eyes water a bit. We had another pastor come in to bless our home, but once he stepped into the door, he looked at the stairs to the second floor, where my brother's room was, and said that it was evil, that we needed to leave as soon as humanly possible. And then he left. A few nights later, everything stopped. This moment of respite continued for almost a week, before I began experiencing it again. I began hearing a soft whisper from down the hallway. I didn't understand the voice, but a voice alone kept me from walking towards that end of the house until daybreak. Basically, our family would hole up in the living room from sunset to daybreak, where everything seemed normal. My parents began to think that the entire ordeal was over, and thought it would be best if we all returned to our rooms and forget that anything ever happened. I told them about the voice, and the idea immediately fell through. At night, I would wake up to hear the voices again, at what I assume was 2-ish, since my clock was in my room and I refused to go back and get it. It was about 8 feet from the garage door, where I heard the voices. They'd say things like,
"Come closer."
then laugh, mockingly, or,
"Please, come here. There's something I want to show you."
then stifle a giggle. I remember one dream at this time, where I had come face to face with a large, horned shadow, held out a blackened silhouette of my house to me, and when I touched it, I became so cold, frightened, and tormented that I woke up and literally pissed myself while screaming in pain. My family began looking for a new home. Finally, one afternoon, the family was getting prepared for the night. Snacks near the furnace, blankets and pillows ready, and the TV to keep our thoughts occupied. I got up to go to the bathroom. It was only around 4 in the afternoon, so we had at least a few hours of daylight left. As I walked to the bathroom, I heard the voice again, and it made me freeze.
"I'm here."
It whispered. It was in the same fucking hall I was. I felt literally paralyzed. I heard footsteps from behind me and felt chilled as they passed, leading to the garage.
"Come on, you little pussy."
It whispered. I couldn't do anything, and for a moment, I thought about simply screaming and collapsing, perhaps hoping it would take pity on a little crying boy. The voice laughed again. Suddenly, with a feeling of overwhelming desperation, I ran to the garage and opened the door and leapt into the cold.
"There!"
I screamed out loud. All I heard was laughter, the kind of laughter where your sides hurt and you can't catch your breath. I felt horrified, humiliated, and alone. My parents, hearing the scream, ran down the hall and found me crying in the garage. The voice began to turn gruff and elderly from here. I know I'm dragging on, so I'll finish up here soon. I recognized it as an old man, but now it didn't sound menacing. It sounded pleading. My brother said that he heard the voices too, but I didn't care. The begging and crying was starting to drive me insane. All it would say was,
"Please, Help an old man.
Or,
I'm so sorry I couldn't handle it.
that weekend, my grandfather, still running the lodge, fell out of a tree while trimming branches away from the lodge sign and broke most of his ribs and his back. The chainsaw, my grandmother told me, landed just a foot or two away, and that it was a miracle he didn't die. Last bit. I was the first to bring up the similarity to our dog from just a few weeks ago, and how the situations were the same. We moved into a friend's home that night. Now, we live just a few miles away in our own home. Since that day, we haven't had any strange incidents, but I still have nightmares. Awful bouts with depression and dreams of killing myself on common occasion. Sometimes I see a man killing my family while I sit on the floor in my sleeping bag, dumbfounded, next to the couches my parents slept on. Let me tell you this. Please, don't fuck with shit like this. I would give anything, not to have moved into that house. It's messed with my head so much. I can't begin to explain how I feel after another nightmare. Hope you had your fill, X. I sure have.